Thanks very much, Jane. And notice the obligatory ecological smug mug I brought with me there, so none of these disposable cups. And actually, it's really nice being at the EcoBuild conference, but you kind of expect, in your mind, you have an idea, a picture, that when you get here, most appropriately, surely a conference like this would be in something like a giant straw bale roundhouse. Not the XL. What's the carbon footprint of this place? If you were up here sitting next to that screen, feel the heat coming off there. There's some energy coming out of that screen. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about not just behavior change, but critically, given what we know about what's actually happening in environmental timeframes, the speed of change. Because it's one thing if you're in a car accelerating towards a cliff edge, agreeing on the objective that you should stop, patting yourselves on the back that you might have slowed the car down from 90 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, but the objective is actually to align what you're doing with the real environmental time frame. And at the moment, nowhere is that happening. In fact, everything is still heading in very much the wrong direction. We know that the last 3 years have been the hottest on record. The UK's Met Office recently said that we may be as little as 5 years away from committing ourselves to crossing the Paris Climate Accord target of 1.5 degrees maximum warming beyond pre-industrial levels. And last year we saw a record rise in the concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, in the atmosphere, in spite of the fact that emissions appeared to be possibly plateauing. And even though coal use might have dropped, we're still 82% dependent on fossil fuels for our energy supplies. So, on the downside, industrialized countries like ours need to see a radical drop in our emissions. On the plus side, we know that we have the technology and the pathways, the ideas, the plans to move towards 100% renewables by 2050 and 80% by 2030. And there's work done, marvelous work done at Stanford University to show us that. So my question really is, can we begin to imagine how that process of change can begin? Because we're constantly told that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than a change to the current economic system and our behavior within it that might align with the scale of the challenge. So I've asked myself the question, are there actually any precedents for this? Do we have some latent, hidden ability for change? And I think, to put my cards on the table, that we do. And that for all these threats and possibilities, our apparent inability to imagine fundamental change is given the lie to by both deep historical events and things more recently. And I give you as my first example the evidence for the jury, something that happened just a few years ago in 2010, when a dormant, unpronounceable Icelandic volcano. Is there anybody here from Iceland, by the way, before I get this completely wrong? Any native Icelandic speakers? Good. So, I think the volcano was called something like Eyjafjallajökull. I won't say that again. Thank you for the single round of applause I got from one person in the audience. Now, we've been brought up to believe that flying cheaply around the world has become our generational divine right. We're told that the British economy and the London economy will collapse if we don't have more runways. Aviation has become second nature, the ability to fly around the world, and yet overnight, a volcano covered in ice flicked a switch that grounded planes all across Europe. What happened? Did the world come to an end at that moment? Well, ladies and gentlemen, no, it didn't. We found, at the drop of a hat, remarkable ways to adapt. People car shared. Train companies put on more trains. Coach companies put on more coaches. People shared their accommodation. Norway's Prime Minister, Jens Stoltenberg, was stuck in the UN. He ran his parliament from his iPad at the UN building. Retailers who'd become dependent upon flying in luxury horticulture from all around the world turned to their British suppliers and said, what seasonal produce can you provide us with? It was different, but the shelves did not empty. So in a moment, you saw, in a glimpse, the skies above Kew Gardens went quiet for once. People turned to each other. They had conversations with people they wouldn't have done because they traveled differently. And everything kept going. And transport is an interesting one because we also have other historical examples about how the transport infrastructure we have today was laid down in a way which shows how quickly we can put in new ways of doing things that can become habituated. Now, it might have taken 15 years just to electrify some of the UK's East Coast main line railway station. But if I take you back just over a century to a weekend in May in 1892, when the task was to change the gauge of part of the Great Western Railway, and starting work at dawn on Saturday morning and finishing work at dawn the following Monday morning, we put down over 170 miles of new railway infrastructure that was then ready to operate. So I would say we need to invite ourselves to raise our ambitions about what can be achieved in short periods of time. Now, the reverse examples about locking in carbon-intensive infrastructure also perversely demonstrate how quickly we can change our patterns and our behaviors. And you can look at how quickly the US interstate highways were laid down in the space of 2 to 3 decades, 47,000 miles of highways, which habituated and addicted North America to the gas-guzzling car. And now we can see in more recent examples how cities like Ghent and Freiburg are turning things around, making cars guests on our roads and developing cultures of walking and cycling, attempting to undo that process. If we're talking about sustainable behaviors, I want to talk about the behaviors of governments as also, and about the loss of ambition and the loss of our ability to imagine how quickly we can do things. Now, we're in the EcoBuild conference, so I thought it would be useful to talk about homes. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. Now, in the last year that I looked the figures up for, the number of social homes built by local authorities squeaked just over about 1,000 in a given calendar year. But go back just a few decades, in a time when this country was a lot poorer, and we still had hanging over the austerity and debts left over from the Second World War, and under both Conservative and Labour governments, we were able to build over 200,000 social homes a year. What happened to that sense of ability and ambition to deliver on change? How did we forget that we can do things like that? Now, in terms of economic policy, if you want to change the economy, we need to be able to reimagine that economy that we find it so hard to believe being different. But let me take you back to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. Just a year before, there were ways of doing things. I mean, the idea in 2006 that we might print money for public purpose to the tune of hundreds of billions of pounds, you would have been laughed at. The idea that we might publicly take control of some of our high street banks, you would have been laughed at. But because the market had been left to its own devices, which led to the financial crisis, which we're still living with the effects of, these things became necessary. In 2006, Gordon Brown boasted about light touch regulation of the City of London. And just a year later, things were very different. So I want to say that even on some of the fundamentals of economic policy, we can change how markets behave, and financial markets importantly. Now, another lesson we might look back to is the speed with which we had to convert industrially at the end of the Cold War. Britain, well, still is, but then was even more so, heavily dependent on its so-called defense industries. They radically reduced, and yet industrial conversion took place. Civilian industries picked up the tab, not just in Britain, but in places like Germany too. Factories have switched to civilian production, and very, very quickly, and with benefits for employment, because many of the civilian industries they went to are much more labor-intensive. We can think back to how quickly we adapted in the face of the challenge of the OPEC crisis. And now we can look at what is happening positively in the energy sphere, which is changing people's energy behaviors. Now, about 500,000 solar panels were installed every day around the world last year. And since 2013, the world has been adding more renewable energy around the world than coal, gas, and oil combined. But what locks in behavior more than anything else is our culture. The fact that wherever you turn, you see messages in radio, in magazines, on TV, on billboards that define you first and foremost as a consumer, not as a citizen with extended responsibilities. I did a little test. I counted for 24 hours a couple of years ago how many times I saw things which prompted me to buy, to consume. and it was over 500. I counted the number of messages I saw in my immediate environment that spoke to me as a citizen with responsibilities, and there were 3. And there were so few, I remembered them. One was a sign at my local station asking me to please not attack the staff that worked there because I had a right to work there without being beaten up. Another one was a sign by the side of the road telling drivers not to run over cyclists. And another one was about a police notice about a mugging. So we constantly have reinforced consumer behavior. But around the world, there are instances of people trying to undo that, change cultures of consumption. In the hardly killjoy city of Sao Paulo in Brazil, the Republican conservative mayor introduced a ban on a lot of public advertising because he saw it as visual pollution and he saw it as undermining public well-being. And he wanted to bring out the city's cultural life and put some of its pressure to consume back in its place. Now, you might think that's a very isolated example. There are 5 states in the US that do similar things. And from Switzerland to France to Sweden, increasingly there are controls over the exposure of children, for example, to advertising, and over advertising in the public place to begin to refashion our public spaces so that they're not just places where we go to consume, consume, consume. Now, there are many, many other examples in which history shows we have the capacity to change behavior. We have the capacity to change infrastructure, the systems which define how we behave and preload our behavior for certain ways of doing things. And I believe we need to learn from those and look at the lessons that can be applied more generally. If you leave things just to individual choice in a marketplace dominated by the needs of finance and economic growth, a lot of precedents suggest that the best you'll get in terms of behavior change is somewhere between 5 and 10%. About 7% is an average figure, often gets quoted about individuals who will, against the grain, elect to do the right thing. We need structural change, different forms of governance and ownership, which are not motivated dominantly by shareholder returns, but more roundedly about public and environmental and social purpose. But we also need ambition to accept the need, the possibility and the potential benefits of change. I'll leave you with 2 thoughts. One is from one of my favorite Swedish writers, a guy called Sven Lindqvist, who says this: "You already know enough, and so do I. It is not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and draw conclusions." And I'm in a happy little space today, not just because I'm in your fantastic company, but also because this work which we've been trying to get going on, looking at what we can learn from current and historical examples of rapid transition, we've just got some funding for the next 3 years, and I'm really interested to hear from people about examples that occur to them, interesting examples of behavior change and rapid transition. We would like to research them more and communicate them and take their lessons to the center of decision making. So I'm going to say thank you very much for listening against all the background noise, and I will hand over to my next speaker. Thank you.